Hello, my name is Armin Behrouzi, and I'm an undergraduate senior here at Cornell. And today I have the pleasure of interviewing two professors who have written very interesting works they'll be speaking about today. We have Professors Vint and Professor Vora. So thank you both for being here today. It's a pleasure to meet you both. Thank you, thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Absolutely. And the first question I have for you both, in trying to create an overarching question, would be the common thread that I see in your works are these questions of labor and the bioethical boundaries of labor. So could you both just speak to how that's played out in your work to give a very general understanding to our viewers of what you've written about?
Should I go first? Yes.
Sure. So the bioethical boundaries of work and labor is something that I've been thinking about for probably about 10 years. And I think for me, the most compelling example is to think about commercial gestational surrogacy. So when you're talking about someone who is exchanging their capacity to carry a pregnancy for a fee or a wage or a stipend, it's interesting to think about how is that labor, right? If labor is the exchange of a service or an action for a wage, and how is it something that doesn't actually fit in the category of labor? So what is pregnancy? What is gestation, right? It's a bodily process. How do you track or quantify what that work is that your cells are doing, right? That your involuntary nervous system is doing, but also the work of self-care, the work of managing your nutrition, your sleep, right? And also the work that it takes to reorganize your sense of who you are as a subject in the world. Someone who's not a parent, right? You're not a parent, you're a surrogate. So I think about all of these things, and they're not unique to surrogacy. They're also found in what Melinda Cooper and Catherine Walby called clinical labor. So people who are actually patients who are getting medical treatment, but only as experimental subjects, only by subscribing to clinical trials. So is that work if you're a patient, if you're sick, right? Is it labor? And so I do think that bioeconomies bring up new questions of not just what are the boundaries of labor, but what should the compensation be? Should people be asked to do these things if they have to do them for care, if they have to do them for medicine, if they have to do them for money?
Yeah, in my work, I draw on speculative fiction, as you know, and so work like people such as your own work, or such as the work of Catherine Walby and Melinda Cooper, these sites where they're studying new kinds of biosubjects and new kinds of biolaborers that are being produced by contemporary biotechnology. Some of these questions have long been anticipated in speculative fiction. And so this sort of question around what it means for the nature of what it means to be human. And in particular, one of the things that I think is really interesting or provocative about how speculative fiction intersects with some of these things are these new regimes of biolabor. They intersect very specifically and very directly with previous kinds of discriminations and exploitations, with overall histories of a kind of disenfranchisement of labor as compared to capital, and specifically with post-colonial instances of that in these kind of global economies of surrogacy services. One of the things I've worked on a lot is organ transplants, and a kind of like international culture of some spaces being sites where organs are procured, and some people being from nations where organs are consumed. And so really thinking through like, how do we have a politics of labor activism in a context where the labor is actually these biological processes of your body. And so as you were saying, these sort of questions of reorganizing your subjectivity, the emotional kinds of ways in which one is implicated in what one is also doing for a wage to sustain oneself, or if not a wage, other kinds of compensations like medical care, or housing sometimes, or even access to the nutrition in the case of some of the people doing surrogacy services. So what that means, that it's not simply your labor power, the efforts of your muscles that you're having to sell in the market to sustain yourself, but it's this entire aspect of your embodied person. And so in some of the texts that I study, they extrapolate these things into generally more dystopian futures, but I think there's also a lot of power in the fact that many of these texts are being written from perspectives and from countries that are seen as the sort of biological resources in this kind of global capitalist bioeconomy imaginary. And so how it is that these fictional texts can be ways of negotiating, working through, responding to, critiquing some of the ways in which a kind of corporate imaginary is representing these technologies as only through their utopian promises of longevity of one's reproductive ability or longevity of life in the case of organ transplants, things like that.
Can I follow up with one thing? I was thinking, actually, I appreciated you mentioning labor activism because one of the issues that people are running into with these questions of, is this work, is this labor, or is this something else, when you're talking about biological processes, is how do you organize protections, right? So we have a work week, we have a work day, we have weekends, we have health insurance that comes to an employer, but there's always been a problem with embodied labor and organizing around it, right? And so we see those same issues that come up with, say, sex work, for example, or housework showing up in biological labor, bioeconomies, because they're in the private sphere often, they're not regulated by national governments or state governments because they don't follow the rules of public labor. And there are all of these things that you can't quantify, right? You can't say that when I was asleep and nurturing my kidney that was going to be transplanted or nurturing the fetus, that was labor time. Was it labor time? So I think it raises a lot of really important questions for how to organize too.
Yeah, and I mean, and they're often feminized. Obviously, surrogacy and selling eggs and things like that is inherently feminized, but organ transplant tends to be feminized as well. And one of the things I just love about your book is the theorizing of that in terms of vital energy and sort of really, so it sort of takes a step beyond Marx's theory of alienation, which I think is speaking to similar kinds of dynamics, but to really make visible that it's life itself that's being extracted through these exploitative labor kind of contexts.
Three things I've noticed that I really liked in your work. One of them was this mention of the militarization of daily life. Another being increased care of the self, which you had covered as well. And another being just this general expanding of bioethical boundaries, all the time. Could you please, speak more about these three factors and how they play into, this absurdity that is best explained, or I guess best shown through sci-fi?
Okay, so I'll start with the militarization of daily life. The part of what I'm interested in studying speculative fictions is the sort of contribution they make to a socio-technical imaginary, to our sense of ourselves and our relationships to technology, the place of technology in our lives. And they have this sort of simultaneous aspirational but also normalizing kind of effect. And so we tend to have a cultural imaginary since at least the early 20th century that largely sees more and more technologization as a better and better life. And one of the things that got me interested in sort of thinking through these intersections is how much future comes up all the time in corporate discourse, in military discourse, a whole relationship towards funding of what Kashif Sundararajan calls venture science and these kinds of speculative discourses. And so in the case of military, one of the things I might point to are ads for the US Air Force or for the US Army that are filmed as if they're science fictional films. And of course, we've had a huge increase since at least the 1980s of these kind of science fictional blockbusters. And into the new millennium, it's very bound up in the sort of what gets called transmedia franchises. So texts that function as simultaneously themselves and advertisements for other texts. So the whole Marvel universe would be the best example of this, that you have Captain America, which is an advertisement to watch the next Avengers film, which is an advertisement to watch the next Thor film, and then you watch the TV show. And so around all that, there's this like image of military technology as heroic, as exciting, as invested in the typical narratives that come out of a longer history of comic books, which has to do with justice and what it means to create an equitable society. And now these things get latched on to technologies, largely through Iron Man, who is a weapons dealer, let's keep in mind. And then that imaginary, those things become conflated together. So then you see the US Air Force making these advertisements where they have people in army uniforms doing the similar kinds of things that people would do in like an Avengers film. And for a while their slogan was, it's not science fiction, it's what we do every day. And so all the sort of positive affects that people have tied up in their enjoyment of these texts get transformed or transferred over into how they're thinking about some of these militarized cultures. A scholar named Colin Milburn has a really interesting book called Mondo Nano that just came out earlier this year, or maybe late last year. And he studies predominantly online digital cultures, including digital games. And one of the terms he comes up with in that book that I think is really exciting is a term of what he calls machinic draft. And so ways in which when we spend so much of our leisure time, and the reason I'm saying it that way is because one of the consequences of these new regimes of labor and trying to theorize around them is like, what is work time? What is leisure time? What is your own time as a person? What is your time as a laborer? These boundaries are very unclear right now. And so one of the things that Colin Milburn argues in his book is how we get drafted into performing certain kinds of actions and normalizing certain kinds of perceptions through all of the time that we spend in these video games, which usually have these militarized kinds of premises to them. So that was one. Now you're gonna have to remind me what your other two were. One was bioethics, right?
Sure, just these ever-expanding guidelines, or these conceptions of what bioethics are and what our boundaries should be. And the other was, this meticulous caring for the self. And one really good example of that is you were mentioning a vampire movie in your work, and one kind of quote, and I'm sorry, I'm going to misquote this. One thing that you had said when analyzing this movie and the society was that in carefully crafting and curating the society of life, another society of death and destruction, a culture of death and destruction is formed.
Ah, okay. So this was probably Daybreakers.
It was Daybreakers.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think that one of the things that interests me, I'm thinking through these things in terms of biopolitical theory, so drawing on Foucault, Giorgio Agamben, increasingly Roberto Esposito, somebody I've been working with. And I'm really interested in this dialectic that happens between all these processes and technologies that are directed at enhancing, expanding, increasing, nurturing life, but it's always at the cost of some other kinds of lives. And this is why this vital energy term that you were using, I thought was really helpful as well. So vampires have long kind of been this folkloric symbol of the privileged, the aristocratic class, sucking the life energy from the poor. And in fact, Marx talks about capital as vampiric, and so that metaphor is kind of long established. But now it becomes sort of made material in this new way by some of these new biotechnologies, where blood or other kinds of body tissues or organs or reproductive material in sperm and egg donations. So these bodily tissues are being transferred from an impoverished class to a privileged class, exactly as sort of prefigured by folkloric vampirism. But the new kind of bioeconomies, they do have this vampiric side to them that we don't really see talked about often enough, I think, in terms of all the ways in which some lives are being enhanced by these tools, is precisely linked to the ways other lives are having the energy extracted from them, whether this be physically in these materials or simply in things like pharmaceutical regimes, right? There was I'm going to get the name wrong, but there was a huge controversy around, I'm pretty sure it was the SARS virus, but it might have been the H5N1, where they were wanting to have biological samples from people worldwide, the WHO was, from people who had contracted the virus in order to enhance vaccine making. And Indonesia was refusing to give samples, and which was seen as some kind of like, horribly selfish move to have made. But in fact, the argument was that these pharmaceutical companies who manufacture these vaccines, who draw on the biological data from people in all kinds of countries, privileged and not, then produce vaccines that are available only to those countries that are privileged and can afford them, or they distribute them first to countries that are privileged and can afford them. And so the sort of very, very biological suffering of people who have contracted diseases becomes part of a data bank that goes to privilege everyone but their own citizens. So those kinds of ways that global capital is vampiric in terms of like specifically biological harvesting, I think is really interesting to think about.
Great. And just quickly before I move on to Professor Vora, a quick thing to note about your work for the viewers is that why it was very important for me was that it took something, two things that I would not compare with each other. So, one, vampire movie genre, and one, this very real problem
Yes.
of bioethical labor that is transcending a lot of cultural and traditional boundaries. And putting a middle ground in between them. I watch these movies and I think that could never happen. But when you really consider it in the context of what's going on, the fact that there are people who support surrogacy but who would never support organ trading outright, when there is a link between those two things and the labor that goes into them. So thank you for that. It was a good segue in.
Yeah, I watch those movies and think that is happening. So.
It's a good way to get people thinking about it.
Thank you.
And Professor Vora, so you've already mentioned it a bit, but I really liked this idea throughout your work of feminized labor and of this vital energy, right, that we consider along with feminized labor. Could you please speak more about why understanding these concepts is so important to understanding this legacy of why, female work, this very taxing biological work often done by females is so widespread?
Sure. So I don't know where this story, I want to tell the story connecting to something that you just said, which is that there are spaces in the world, there are spaces in a city where the primary energy that people are using during the day is getting evacuated and invested somewhere else. And then there are the places that are they're benefiting from that investment, whether it's financial, whether it's like in Los Angeles, you have everyone busing in to do service work and domestic work and then busing out of the city center at the end of the day. So however you want to look at it, and I know you're in city planning, so you can think about it at the scale of city. So you have these places where you're generating labor that's for somewhere else. And so one of the things I'm interested in is how that kind of map of the globe correlates to, we could say, a map of the public and private, or even a map of the household. So if we think about the nature of feminized labor, we can start with the creation of the nuclear heteropatriarchal family. So that wasn't always a historical given, right? It wasn't always a norm. And that process, there's a feminist materialist, Maria Mies, she describes that process, which was very violent, right? You had to basically frighten, scare, beat, prosecute women out of the public sphere to make this figure of the housewife, to get women to be domesticated as wives. And so the housewife is created as a subject, and the idea is that the man of the house will work outside. He'll exchange his labor for a wage through a contract, and then the female in the house will do the work in the home in exchange for love through the marriage contract. So she also works through a contract, but it makes the labor invisible. It happens in the home, it's not regulated in the public, and it's in exchange for love, not a wage. So then we take that and we can kind of map that onto the history of colonialism. In my work, that's what I'm interested in. So how do you have entire national economies that were originally set up to benefit a colonial metropole? And then suddenly you fought for independence, you win independence, and you've got a domestic economy that's not organized to support itself. The whole infrastructure of the country is made to export all of the surplus, right? So what happens is that, in my research, that international lending takes up where colonialism left off, and you have structural readjustments in exchange for IMF and World Bank loans. And so in India in 1991, this meant that the economy had to be organized so that it could sell what they had most of in order to get foreign currency, and that was labor. And the labor that was needed was service labor. And so India's economy becomes dominated by service labor, which because of that household relationship is gendered female. It doesn't matter who's doing the work, right? It doesn't matter the gender of the person at that level. The labor itself is gendered female. It's understood to be unskilled, whether or not it's skilled, right? It's largely invisible, and it's not understood to be creative or innovative, right? It reproduces what's already there. And so as we know, it's creativity and innovation that gives someone authorship of work. It gives someone credibility for being skilled. So most of the so-called third world, you can say even the global south, so when we talk about a city, is performing that work, and then someone else is benefiting. So if it was a husband who worked outside of the home in that original scene, right, the domestic scene, it's now the people who can afford to outsource that work, whether it be across the city or across the globe. So you have households that look like they have very high-skilled, high-powered people in them, but in fact, those people would be impossible without this system of what I call life support, right? And it reaches across the globe. And the more privileged you are, the more individuals are underneath your life supporting it. So in my mind, that labor is feminized because it's invisible and it's underwaged, it's undercompensated, and it's understood to be non-innovative and non-creative when in fact, I think that it's a social inheritance that's inaccurate.
So another, big theme in your work for me was arguing that this is a different type of work in terms of, the biological investment that's made. And this, in essence, completely separates it from types of work where there isn't so much of a bodily investment. Mm-hmm. And a really good example I liked was how, in the beginning of one of your works that we read, you mentioned a call center worker and how, she graduates from college, she goes, this seems like a good line of work, I'll go into it. And you don't think about it, but she's giving up her nights, she's giving up her days, she's giving up any kind of, cultural growth with the people around her, her family, in order to learn about this new culture abroad. She's acculturized and she learns, American ways of talking about things, about ways that we approach problems, ways that Americans think, and it becomes her life, it consumes her. And I think that in that sense, it's a very valid argument that it's under that type of work as well, that type of work that's biologically taxing. Mm-hmm. And so I really appreciated including something like that, call center work, something that I don't think immediately, comes to a lot of our minds as a type of very biologically taxing work.
I mean, you can extend this argument indefinitely and say that all of us have to do certain kinds of physical and biological work to make ourselves appropriate for a job. And actually, there have been some really interesting studies on the organization of schools during the industrial age to basically teach kids to sit still all day, to be apart from their families, to normalize that so that they can then go, finish school and go into factories. And now there's work that's arguing that, especially in low-earning, low-resource neighborhoods of cities, schools are basically teaching children the embodiment they need to go into prison. So people talk about the school-to-prison pipeline. So I think that it's not just, in the Global South, in post-colonial spaces where we find this, but it becomes so the call centers become interesting because there's an intersection there between colonial history and economics and then technology. So, we're talking about where do fiber optic cables get laid down, and once they're laid down, there's an infrastructure there. And so someone once asked me a really interesting question. They said, what is it about, what is the relationship between technology and the nature of embodiment for call center work? Well, it's the voice. So fiber optics can only carry certain kinds of data, right? They can carry image and sound, and obviously binary code. But so the voice becomes really important. Performing a certain vocal self becomes important if you're talking about call centers. And so language becomes important, accent becomes important. The way that you can project affect through the voice becomes important. So the nature of how the work is embodied also it articulates very closely with the technologies that convey it between those spaces of as you said, the producing of material, of almost we could say raw material if it's bodies, right? And then the consumption, as you said, the spaces of consumption.
And it goes into with this underlying idea of like the dissipation of self. that I think is very clear throughout your work as well, where, you know, this woman is neutralizing her accent. She's neutralizing everything about her and her upbringing in order to serve another fully. And, you know, I think the surrogacy was a good example with that as well. And, you know, especially in a case where you're carrying someone else's baby and there is no genetic imprint of yours, you were just a womb. And I think, you know, that's a very common underlying theme. And I think that's another thing that separates this type of work from maybe, you know, the taxing type of work that we would do in this country. You know, people go into finance consulting and they say, I feel like I'm putting everything into it, when there's a big difference. So thank you for that. And I wanted to ask you, Professor, about what you think the future of sci-fi will be like. You know, with so many, you know, with the decades in the past, and it's surprising how far back. I did a little research before our interview, how far back people were predicting, you know, a lot of the phenomenon that we're seeing today. So with these expanding boundaries, and with, you know, the layman thinking, what more could be done at this point? You know, what more exploitation could be done? What more absurdity can be done? Where do you think the future of sci-fi is headed? Well,
I mean, I think science fiction projects futures, but I don't know that it necessarily predicts them. I mean, every once in a while there's like an overlap between something that appears first in science fiction and later in the world, and then people are like, oh, science fiction predicted that. But I think it's the relationship as I see it, I'm more interested in how science fiction constructs a certain kind of imaginary around technology, but then technology is also built with an imaginary too, and so science fiction is responding to that, but also informing that, because some of the work I've done is about the relationship between scientists and science fiction, and many of them do enjoy and read science fiction. And so if I can touch back on something that you were saying about surrogacy and this idea of the woman being like just a womb, I think was the phrase you used. I mean, there's a technological history of constructing that image of pregnancy, right? And a feminist scholar named Valerie Hartuni has a really interesting book on this topic, that it's through technologies of being able to visualize the fetus and turn the fetus into the patient that then we can erase the woman from the pregnancy, or imagine that pregnancies could happen in some kind of tanks, that they could be completely separated from biological reproduction. And there's a lot of science fiction around that, and imagining a kind of classed or raced difference between individuals that are born out of those processes versus individuals born out of human bodies. And so I think it's sort of less the future of science fiction that I'm interested in, and more the ways in which it continues to participate in the constructions of our imaginary around technology, and technology continues to construct different kinds of life ways, different kinds of ways in which we're entrained to imagine the self. And so it's less its predictive aspect that I'm interested in, and more that it is always, whatever future it's set in, it's always writing about the moment that produces it, and what kind of cultural and preoccupations around science and technology inform that moment. And the more we let a kind of fascination with technological determination inform our imagining of this moment, the more these regimes of technology simply colonize, is maybe the word I want to use, or perhaps not, but they inhabit and take over previous structures of systemic discrimination, and that means these technologies enhance inequality as much as anything else. One last thing I will say is that a really exciting thing happening in science fiction right now is that the range of people interested in and writing the genre has rapidly expanded over the last 15 or so years. In many people's imagination, I think particularly people who don't read a lot of science fiction, or who see only Hollywood images of science fiction, it's a very privileged, Western, usually white, usually male kind of genre. And certainly in moments in its history, those would be the people who've dominated the genre. But it was also taken up as a tool by feminists to start articulating different futures, and especially different futures around reproduction. It was taken up as a tool by African American activists and scholars in the movement that's come to be called Afrofuturism. And so using the genre to respond to how technology is shaping your life can be used in these critical dimensions as much as these celebratory ones. And we've seen a huge increase in people of color writing science fiction, and science fiction being produced from parts of the world that were generally the colonized rather than the colonizers. And so I think we're really seeing a shift in whose technological imaginary is being given voice, and that I think leads to exciting possibilities for the genre's future.
This idea of just compensation, or compensation that seems suitable if this practice should even exist with regards to surrogacy. Could you expand a little bit more on that? I found that very interesting.
Oh, sure. I also want to go back to something you mentioned in your follow-up to my last comment, which was you said we were talking about the way that technology and social norms come to construct surrogacy as the use of just using a womb, right? But also the idea that the parents are the people from whom the DNA comes, not the surrogate. And actually it turns out that there's been a renaissance in the study of something called fetal cell microchimerism, which is a field that studies the cellular interchange between the gestational body and the fetal body, and the cells don't go always back to the original bodies. And this is true of any maternal body that's carried other siblings as well. So we all have cells from the woman who gestated us as well as the woman who gestated her and any siblings that became before us. So there is DNA exchange, and these cells do things. They have significance in immunology. So the reason I start with that is then to go back to the idea of what is just compensation. You have to go back to the idea of what is the social relation here, right? And so since you brought up Karl Marx, I'll go back to Karl Marx, which is, Karl Marx says, and Marxists say that the commodity exchange is actually enacting social relations that without commodification we would actually just have with one another. So what is the social relation between a gestational surrogate and the intending parents, or between the gestational surrogate and the infant that's born through her surrogacy? And that's something that there's a lot of work that's going into how to define that relationship. So medicine is saying that it's just the uterus that we're using. It's in vitro fertilization. We create the embryo and then we implant it. We make her ready for the pregnancy, and then when she's done, she's done. That's not the experience of women who go through surrogacy necessarily. And so when you're talking about how technology in some ways materializes the way that we already imagine humans to be, society to be, this is what we're seeing. We're seeing all of this work through technology, through medical discourse, through social and legal discourse, saying all this is 9 months of renting a womb, when in reality nobody's living it that way. So what is ethical compensation can only be determined when people can come to consensus on what is that actual social relation and what's being exchanged. And so in my interviews with women who have been surrogates in India, what they want is very different than what the law says they should get as laborers. What they want, and this is in the book, is some kind of guarantee of an open future of obligation from the commissioning parents to them. It doesn't necessarily mean money. It doesn't necessarily mean kinship. It just means an openness to some future possibility and some future relation. And is that compensation? They also would, most women would also prefer to get higher fees, right? It's an underpaid form of action. So there are a lot of things that feminist activists in India are working around, especially around health and labor. So healthcare needs to be part of the compensation. But I also think that, when I was mentioning labor organizing, part of the problem is to organize around the compensation for something or the entitlements, you have to agree on what's being exchanged. You have to agree on what is the just social relation there. And so, I kind of think of it in the context of things like the demand for third world debt forgiveness or student loan forgiveness. There's this idea that there's the financial world, there's the world of exchange, but then there's this whole other history of social relation. So for example, if commissioning parents come from England to India and hire an Indian woman to be their surrogate, there's a whole history of colonialism there. Why is she a surrogate in the first place? Why can't she get the job that she'd rather have? Because most women don't become surrogates because it's their dream job. They'd rather do something else. Why can't they do something else? How does that history matter here? So it's a huge question, right? It's a huge question of what is the relation, what is the material relation, what is the social relation? And I think it's going to take many, many people to answer that question.
With the recent slew of laws that now the latest one being the banning of foreign parents effectively using their genetic material to have a surrogate in India, how does that work? Because we had read about how a lot of this work is shifting to Nepal, and how there might be a future of regulation in Nepal. Where do you see this future heading?
Well, I'm not clairvoyant, but I can tell you that from my interviews, which were done in 2008, it was clear to me that everyone involved would like the practice to continue with better, as you said, compensation, entitlements, protections, especially legal protections. And one of the reasons the ban was initiated is that since 2010, India has been trying to pass national legislation to regulate and register the practice of ARTs and surrogacy in India. So there's been no way to monitor these practices because there's no mandatory reporting. So we'll see what happens with the ban. If it continues, the practices will likely move elsewhere, and women will travel with the clinical practices elsewhere. And I've been hearing just anecdotal stories about where people are going, and it does include Nepal, but other places like Kenya, Southeast Asia. So there's an infrastructure for what is called fertility travel or medical travel, and so that's probably what will happen. I can't predict, but I do know that just based on media coverage, most people who are involved as participants, including intending parents, including physicians and surrogates, including technicians, believe the practice should continue in some form, whereas many policy makers, especially feminists, don't think that there is necessarily an ethical way for it to move forward, and they've been tracking the industry very carefully. So I personally I'm not speaking to anyone right now about it, but I think those are the trends at least.
Something you both expanded on that I think is very interesting to note is how there are these existing structures in place. Whether it's post-colonialism, whether it's this history of one population serving another, and how it always continues to play out in some form of way. So it seems like there's always some sort of transformation. There's always, whether one type of labor is outlawed, it seems like another one is just going to pop in its place, where that system forms once again. And there's that group of people who are giving up their livelihood in some way, whether how abstract or how physical, to another, to a more privileged population. So I think it's a very interesting thing in both your works that pop up. So where do you see, for our viewers that are interested, where's your work headed next? What are your next projects?
My next project is a collaborative project with Neda Atanasaski at UC Santa Cruz, and it's a book about artificial intelligence and robotics and the way that they're building really specific ideas of what is the human, speculative ideas. They're basically worlding, as Donna Harry would say, certain ideas of what is the human. And we're looking at specifically, because we both work in ethnic studies and feminist studies, we're looking at how race, gender, ability, class get built into technological infrastructure, whether that be sort of the learning systems and cognitive science that inform artificial intelligence projects, or the actual way that robots can move and what they can do, why they're understood only to replace the sort of productive work functions of human beings and not the other functions. And then we're also looking at people who are creating prototypes for robots programmed with neuroses and errors, robots that don't do the things that industrial robots are made to do. So we're sort of looking at, you could call them artistic or dissident robotics and AI projects.
I like that.
Yeah, dissident, because one of the things that we're interested in is how do you talk about politics without assuming there's a certain agent or subject, right? So if you want to talk about the politics of labor, do you have to go back to that proletarian worker? So what if you want to talk about gendered work? What if you want to talk about feminized work? You can't use that subject, that agent, that actor. So we decided to look at robots and think about political action as it occurs through non-subjects, robots. And we're looking at a lot of speculative fiction. So that's my next project.
So I'm still continuing to do some work on this kind of biopolitics and science fiction. Most of what I've done so far has been really how it intersects with medical cultures. But through that, I started to do some research of people who are doing ethnographic work around pharmaceuticals. Mm-hmm. And then through that, that led me to thinking about agricultural technologies. And so some of the ways colonial relations and some of the same patent regimes that I was interested in interrogating around medical properties are also playing out in kind of agricultural sectors, because there is also ways in which the very capacity of certain populations to sustain their life is being interfered with by a legal relationship to the genomics of certain plants held by certain corporations. So it's still all tied into like global capital, which sort of always remains a object of inquiry or critique for me. And then other work I'm doing with a collaborator, Jonathan Alexander from UC Irvine, is actually about questions of democracy. And we're looking at a lot of science fiction television programs and how this recurrent thing in a number of the programs that have been made in the last 10 years is this notion of a kind of split America. There's all these narratives that have to do with like refighting the Revolutionary War, much more so than the Civil War, actually. Even though it's about a split, it's always about a kind of Revolutionary War imagery very directly. And so we're seeing, trying to analyze this as a space where some of the consequences of the shifts in American society following 9/11 are able to be articulated in this way that's displaced enough that it doesn't touch too closely on the kind of real losses that are still felt, but we're still able to have a discourse around like what it means to be an occupied state, what it means to be an occupier, what it means that questions of liberty and freedom have now become about market freedom instead of more liberal democratic notions of freedom. So I think that's why we see the Revolutionary War as so key to these narratives, because we're trying to rethink what it means to liberate ourselves from a kind of corporate colonizer in some ways.
Great. Thank you both for your interviews today. Great.
Thank you.